There's a lot of black Americans that want to delineate themselves from Africa and they are denying their African heritage. So, what would you tell them as a direct descendant of the Clotilda?
My response to that is, how can you deny who and what you are, where you originated? It's very difficult to know where you're going if you don't know from whence you came. We are products of the continent of Africa. And I'm very proud to be connected with the continent because I can trace my family history all the way back to not only my great-grandmother who was on the Clotilda, but her parents who were born in Africa and died there. So we will always and forever be connected to the continent of Africa. So for you to deny your heritage, I don't think it's quite right.
There's some that say, oh, if we came from Africa, where's the proof of the ships? They say, how come we don't see the wreckage, the wreckages of the ships that brought us to America? And, they just want to wipe out all the historical records around transatlantic slave trade. So what is the Clotilda?
Very good question. We actually have evidence. We have proof that the Clotilda exists because it's been found again. And to tell you the truth, the ship was never really actually lost. There are those in the community who did not want it to be found again. But it's been documented. We have transcripts from the ship captain on what he did and how the voyage actually took place. As a matter of fact, we give tours now throughout the month to the location to where the ship actually rests in the bottom of the Mobile River, which is at 12 Mile Island, which is just north of the city of Mobile.
So, your African identity, how are you confident about it?
My African identity is what made me who I am today. I'm very proud of who and what I am, where I came from.
Where do you trace your your Africanness to?
My ancestor, Lottie Dennison, was on the last slave ship Clotilda, which left the country of Benin. It's now called it was called Dahomey at that particular time, but it's now the country of Benin. And that's where we captured. And at that time, Dahomey was a very powerful country in West Africa. And it covered a lot of surrounding territory. And unfortunately, like all great civilizations, they enslaved those that they captured. And by being coerced by people from Europe, they set up a slave trade and made trades with the Europeans and the Americans too for the people that they captured. Some of them came to America. And that's where my grandmother came from Benin to America. And they landed in the city of Mobile, the port city of Mobile, Alabama. And that's where she was placed when she came here and she arrived here. And what's ironic about her story, when she got here on the Clotilda, the first African American, we use that word right here for this situation, that she actually saw was her future husband by the name of James Dennison. James was not on the Clotilda. He was of Cherokee and African descent, and they were actually married at a later date.
Well, so, as a descendant, as a direct descendant of the Africans that were brought to America on the Clotilda, what do you tell Black Americans that are still grappling with the question of identity?
I don't think it should be difficult at all. Because right now, I was born in America. So I am an American. But my ancestors came from the continent of Africa. And I'm proud to wear the tag as an African American because that's where my roots are. And I'll always be proud of that. And even as a little child, my mother, Mabel Dennison, always instilled that in me. As a matter of fact, she did 2 memoirs on her grandmother and grandfather that allowed us to have as much information that we do about our family history, and I'm very proud of that fact.
Have you been to Africa?
No, I have not.
Do you plan on going?
I would very much like to go.
Okay. What do you envision Africa as? Like, I mean, when you think about Africa, what do you think?
I think of Africa is multifaceted. That's the way I look at it, because, some areas they may be considered third world, but at the same time, there are other metropolis areas that are very progressive. There are areas in between as well. It's a mixture, just like it is in America. You have some of the same breakup in America that you have in Africa. And unfortunately, sometimes even people of my color in America have been brainwashed to the point that they think that Africa is nothing but wilderness and that the people are savages. Africa is the cradle of civilization. So how can you come to that decision? But you have to do your research. You have to try and go back and develop and understand what your roots actually consist of. That way you have a better understanding of what the continent of Africa is about.
Yeah, absolutely. First time in Alabama, first time in Mobile, first time in Africatown. For the first time in America, I have felt at home.
Good.
Coming all the way from Kenya to America and coming here, I mean, I feel home. This is for the first time, I feel I am among my people.
Yes,
for the first time, I feel like these people are Africans. You know what I mean? I will even remove the word American on it and just leave it African.
Okay.
So this is what I feel. So tell me something about Africatown, because I believe there is something about Africatown.
Africatown is what I consider sacred soil, simply because the Africans, and we have to make sure we remember and understand, these people at one time were free. They were placed into slavery. They were not born into slavery, which is a big difference from what most people in America had to deal with. And fortunately, they were only slaves for 5 years. When that 5-year period was up, they were free once again. So they were used to being free people. And I think that's one reason why they were able to flourish as quickly as they did, because they were used to being free in the beginning. So they just went back to what they were. And that's also why they tried to hold on to many of their family traditions when they were brought to America. So they tried to hold on to what they had in Africa, but at the same time, they incorporated some of the New World's traditions into what they're doing too, simply by them being here.
You brought out something very interesting about them being able to hold on to something that they came with from Africa, right?
Yes.
But there's a larger group of African Americans that came here before who had already had everything about them stripped off. So how were these few, 110, how were they able to hold on to that African beads, that African clothes, that African, literature, or anything that shows indeed these people are Africans? And we have others that they don't have that.
Well, I think it primarily is based on their community as a whole. They already had something established after they first got here. It was not like they had to start from scratch. So they were already together as a community, as a unit. So they just actually allowed that part of them to grow and to incorporate everything that they had brought from Africa into what they had in America. So it wasn't difficult at all. Remember, they were not born here. They were free people. So they actually knew what life was like before slavery. So it was just a matter of them going back to pretty much the life they had prior to slavery for them. Now you have to keep in mind, all the people that were on the Clotilda did not settle in this area. As a matter of fact, my particular family settled just south of what we call downtown Mobile, which is down the bay. So that's where my family actually built its roots, but we still held on to our African beliefs and traditions as well.
So you guys have some cultural activities, cultural traditions that goes back to Africa?
Yeah. One in particular is the area of tradition of honoring our ancestors.
Like pouring libation?
Yes, libations, exactly. And we do that every year when we honor them at the landing. And also whenever we visit the ship site itself, we do the libation. And as you know, the libation is done. We always speak an ancestor's name during the libation ceremony. And we don't just do it for our descendants, we do it for current members that are descendants of the Africans as well. So that's one tradition that we try to make sure we hold on. And that's one that we try to make sure we pass on to our children and our grandchildren, so they'll be aware, because it's very important that you don't lose sight of where you came from. You have to hold on to those traditions as best you can.
There's something that I noticed. You guys are coming together and you talk about the Clotilda, you talk about the slavery, you talk about how your ancestors were brought here. I don't think this happens a lot in America, especially up north or in the west coast of America. I mean, just all of America. I don't think this happens a lot.
You know what? Some of it is because of lack of knowledge. And if you're not aware of certain things that took place, you can't really talk about it. But I mentioned earlier my mother, who was blessed to do 2 memoirs, one on my great-grandmother and great-grandfather. And even though they died before she was born, she talked to her older siblings, because she was the youngest of the siblings. So she got all the information from them on her own research by going to the library, the genealogy department, and she had the opportunity to work at the City Mobile Museum, which put her in perfect place to gain as much knowledge and information that she could about our ancestors. So it all has come full circle, and we're passing it on to our children and their children.
Okay, you know, in the African traditions, stories are passed down by the word of mouth.
Yes.
And that's where, you know, the winner gets to tell the story, right? When the Europeans came, we didn't have any recorded history, right? Like, because, you know, during the evenings, gather at a bonfire, and the elderly in the family, you know, tells the stories of old. So I think this is something that you guys have held on to, like telling the stories, like the way your mom did, right?
Yes.
Like passing it down throughout generations.
That's correct. As a matter of fact, my mother, in her memoir, would share not only in the memoir, but with me, being an only child, how her great-grandmother would talk to her grandchildren and her children about stories that her mother and father would tell her while she was in Africa. And I can remember some of the stories in particular that she told my great-grandmother about how one particular story was about how this young girl was coerced into leaving the tribe by the jungle, even though she was asked not to do so by her parents. But she went with it anyway. And before they got into the jungle, the guy that had coerced her from her family began to disjoint himself, his body, a joint at a time, to the point where there was nothing left but his head. And at that time, she had come with him in this tree, in the base of this tree, which actually surrounded her, and she could not escape. And so she was there in the base of that tree for the rest of her life. Now, whether or not this story was true, I have no clue. But it was one of the stories and the ways that the Africans used to teach their children to be obedient, because that was the root of the story. The daughter disobeyed her parents. So that was her fate for disobedience.
Okay, I was burning, with curiosity about bridging the gap between African Americans and Africans from the continent. So there is a tension between these two groups of people who, in my opinion, happens to be the same people. But I know there's a lot that will be offended by that statement, but it's okay. How do we bridge the gap between us as black people? Because for me, I believe if I go to Jamaica, if I go to the Bahamas or Brazil, I see a black person, I see an African. How do we come together and be one people again?
What we're doing right now, have a conversation, getting to know one another. See, unfortunately, the powers that be have taken it upon itself to try and separate us, to try and distort history itself, so that we don't actually feel a connection to our ancestors or to our relatives that are alive today. That's why it's incumbent upon us to share the story, to share our stories, to communicate with one another. And as I said earlier, do your history, do your research for your family history, and you will see just how closely connected we are. How you do that history, how do you connect one another? By going to a library, by going to city records, by going to the genealogy department, talking to your older members in the family that have some knowledge of the history that was passed down to them, so they can in turn share it with you. That gives you an opportunity to share it with your family, current and in the future.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. I think for me, you have answered some of my main questions that, I was burning with curiosity. But what would you like to tell my viewers?
Viewers, I would like to tell you, be proud of who you are. Be proud of what you are. Because your history has been important, it will always be important. But it's incumbent upon us to make sure that the world does not forget who we are, where we came from. If we don't do that, if we don't spread that word or share that information or that knowledge, we can't expect anyone else to do so. It's important that we do that ourselves. And if you would, be sure and subscribe to this channel.
Okay. Yeah, the channel name is Our Story by Us. You don't put spaces in between the words. You just write the words Our Story by Us. And that's the reason why I am down here in Mobile, Alabama, so I can let my brother here tell his story himself. Thank you so much for tuning in. All right. I appreciate you, man.
I appreciate you taking the time to gather this information. Because